Now let's see how to deploy from an Azure DevOps repo. First, we'll configure App Service to pull the code and build it using the Kudu build server in App Service. Then in the next clip, we'll configure an Azure pipeline to build and deploy the code. Let's go to Azure DevOps, which is at dev.azure.com. I've already signed up for a free Azure DevOps account using my administrator login. The first thing we need to do is create a project. Projects hold code repositories and pipelines. Under the Advanced tab, you can select which version control system to use, either Git or Team Foundation version control. We're going to create a local Git repository, so we'll leave Git. And let's create this project. When the project gets created, let's go to the Repos tab. It says the project is empty and provides a Git URL to the project repository and the ability to generate Git credentials, which is just a username and password to allow for pushing code into the repository. Let's minimize this for now, and let's go into Visual Studio. And rather than modify the configuration of our existing project that's using GitHub, I'm going to create a new project in Visual Studio. This will be exactly the same, so in ASP.NET Core Web App, and I'll give this project a name. And let's leave the defaults for .NET. And this won't be a container app. The project will get created. And once it is, let's go to the home page again and update this text. Okay, now let's create the local Git repository from the Git menu at the top. This time, we're going to create the remote repository at the same time, but we're going to use Azure DevOps. I have a few accounts I've used before. So let's select the one with the organization where we just created the project in Azure DevOps. So it's picked up the default organization and the only project, and it's given the remote code repository the same name as the local one. So I'll just click Create and Push. Okay, it'll take a few seconds to push the code to Azure DevOps, and the notification at the bottom says it was successful. So let's go over to Azure DevOps, and we're already on the repos page. So let's refresh the page. It says the deployment project is empty still. So it looks like the code didn't get pushed. But remember, a project can hold multiple repositories. And we gave the one we created a different name. So go over to the drop-down here, and there's the new repository. Select it, and now we can see the code that was uploaded. Now we're ready to configure the app service to pull the code in and build it using the Kudu build server. So let's open up the app service. This time, we'll use the second web app on this app service plan. Now let's go down to Deployment Center. And let's select Azure Repos from the source dropdown. It says it will be building with the App Service Build Service, which is the Kudu extension. But there's also a warning that SCM Basic Authentication is disabled for your app. Remember, we saw this in the previous module when we pushed code from Visual Studio. So Azure DevOps will be authenticating with basic authentication using the publish profile, which is a username and password. We need to enable SCM basic authentication for this app service in the configuration section. Just check this box and save these changes. Now we can go back to Deployment Center and choose Azure Repos again. There's an option to change the build provider. Let's see what else is available. We can also build the code using Azure Pipelines. In this case, we have to do all the configuration from the Azure DevOps side. App Service won't write any scripts for us here. So let's go back to the Kudu build provider, and let's configure this. I'll select the organization, and it's picking up my administrator credentials, so there's no need to log into Azure DevOps. I'll select the project and the repository, and we want the master branch. Okay, we just need to save this. Now let's go to the Overview page and browse to the deployed site. It still shows the default page created by Azure App Service. The way this deployment approach works is that App Service gets notified when the code in the Azure repo changes, and that's done using a webhook. That tells App Service to pull the code in, build it using the Kudu service, and then deploy it. So we need to make a change to the code in the repo. Let's go back to Visual Studio and update the home page and save this. Now let's go to the Git Changes tab and commit these changes locally. Now we can push the changes up to the remote Git repository in Azure Repos. Once it's pushed, that'll kick things off in the Azure App Service. Let's go back to the App Service. And it will take a few minutes for the build and deployment to take place, so I'll pause the recording. And after a few minutes, we're ready to browse to the deployed application. And the changes have been built and deployed by App Service. Let's just go back into App Service and down to the Deployment Center, and let's look at the logs that were generated. The logs today show the deployment information. So that's one way to deploy from Azure DevOps to App Service. But it doesn't give you much control over the process. You can't add any steps in for code quality testing or any of the other things you might want to do during continuous integration. So we're going to look at how to configure an Azure pipeline to build and deploy our code next. But first, let's go to the Settings tab here and disconnect this deployment configuration so we can configure things from the Azure DevOps side. Now we're ready to configure the Azure DevOps pipeline, so let's do that next. Let's configure an Azure pipeline in Azure DevOps to build and deploy the code. But before we do that, there's been a change to Azure pipelines for newly created accounts, and since I just created this DevOps organization, this will affect me. Microsoft has temporarily disabled the free grant of parallel jobs for public projects and certain private projects in new organizations. So running any pipeline in my project will currently fail. But you can request to have that changed by filling out the form at aka.ms azpipelines-parallelism-request. You just need to provide your name, email address, and the name of your Azure DevOps organization, and whether this is for public or private projects. I submitted this, and it took about 12 hours before I received an approval email. So again, if you have an older DevOps organization, this shouldn't affect you. I'm actually going to show you in the demo what happens if you don't set this up. The deployment will fail, and then we'll complete the deployment once parallel jobs have been enabled. So we're almost ready to configure a pipeline, but first we need to configure authentication to Azure. We do that by creating a service connection. Let's go to Project Settings and to Service Connections on the left menu. I'll create a new service connection, and there are lots of services to choose from. The one we want is Azure Resource Manager. Click Next, and we have some options to choose from. The default authentication method is Workload Identity Federation. This is a relatively new option. This allows you to configure trust between your Azure DevOps organization and an Azure Service Principal. Azure DevOps then uses OpenID Connect to provide a token that can be used to authenticate to the Azure API and receive a short-lived authorization token. This means that no secrets need to be stored in Azure DevOps. It's all done using Federation and OAuth 2.0. So let's choose this, and on the next screen, we can scope the level of authorization to the subscription, to a management group of subscriptions, or to a machine learning workspace. I'll leave subscription, and we can further scope it to a resource group to limit access. Let's get the name of the resource group by going to the Azure portal to App Services, and let's use the app service from the previous clip. The name of the resource group is right here, and this app service already has the code deployed to it. So back in Azure DevOps, I'll select that resource group and give this service connection a name. And I won't give it access to all the pipelines, just this one. Let's save these changes and set up the connection. Let's go back to the project. And now let's go to Pipelines and create a new pipeline. Azure Pipelines doesn't restrict you to only using repos in Azure DevOps. You can pull code in from other code repositories, like GitHub, Bitbucket, and generic Git servers. We already have our code in Azure repos in this project though, so let's select that and then choose the repo. We need to select a platform in order to get some default YAML generated. This looks similar to the YAML you saw in GitHub Actions earlier, but it's not exactly the same. They aren't interchangeable. This default code is using MS Build, and we're going to do things differently. We'll leave the code for the trigger, so this pipeline will get run when there's a change to the code in the master branch. The VM image that's used to build the code will be a Windows VM, and we can leave these variables. Under Steps, let's delete these default steps. Now let's add some steps. We'll keep this really simple. I'll paste in the first step, which will be a script that runs the .NET build command on the command line. So this is similar to what you saw in GitHub Actions, except we don't need to check out the code first. That's already done for us. Next, we want to publish the compiled code to a file that we can deploy. Let's go to the assistant on the right, and that lets us choose from existing tasks in the Azure DevOps Marketplace. These are ones that are always available, but you can go to the Marketplace and install others if you need to. Let's select the .NET Core task. The command we want is publish. I'll uncheck these options. All we need is to publish web projects. And we don't need to change the working directory. Add this, and it adds the YAML code. And we don't need these parameters, so I'll remove them. Okay, now we need a task to deploy the code to Azure. I'll search for Azure App. There are a few options here. There's one called Azure App Service Deploy, but we're going to use this one called Azure Web App. First, I'll choose the service connection we created earlier. Then the app type is Web App on Windows. I'll select the app service from the list. And we're not going to deploy to a deployment slot this time. We'll leave the default package to pick up from the build. So this task will look for a zip file. And under the additional options, we can choose to deploy using zip deploy or run from package. You saw both of those in the previous module. And under the other dropdown, you can modify app settings and configuration settings. Let's add this task to the steps. That's actually all we need to build and deploy the code. So I'll click Save and Run. And I'll leave the default commit message, and let's run this. Because this is the first time running this pipeline, there's a message that the pipeline needs permission to access a resource before this run can continue. Just click View on the message and approve the permission. Now if I click on the job, there's an error. It says no hosted parallelism has been purchased or granted. You can either enable billing for your Azure DevOps subscription and pay to run the pipeline, or fill out the form I showed you at the beginning of this clip and wait until permission is granted for your DevOps organization. I did that after filming this part of the demo, and then waited until permission was granted by Microsoft. Now we can go to Pipelines and click on the pipeline, and now we can manually run this pipeline. It shows that there's a job queued, so a VM is being picked up from the pool. And once it starts running, the code gets checked out. The build takes place. This .NET Core CLI task is the publish task. I didn't set the display name. And now the task is running that will deploy the code to Azure. And again, I could have modified this display name, so this would be more obvious. It looks like it's going to deploy the zip file and update the application settings to run from package, so to mount the zip file. And the job completed successfully. So let's go over to the Azure portal, and inside the app service, let's go to the overview page and browse. The same app was deployed, so we can't see any change, but let's go back into the portal and down to Deployment Center. And now it shows that the deployment is configured from Azure Pipelines, and the log shows a successful deployment. The links here will actually take us into Azure DevOps to view details of the commit and the build. In this module, you learned how to deploy code using continuous integration and continuous deployment from GitHub and Azure DevOps. First, we reviewed the two providers, and then we configured a repo in GitHub, and then a GitHub Actions workflow. We updated the code in the repository to trigger the workflow and deployment to a deployment slot in the app service. Then we swapped the deployment slots to promote the app to production. Next, you saw how to configure a repo in Azure DevOps and to have App Service get triggered when the code changes. So App Service can pull in the code and build it using the Kudu service, then deploy the code to the app service. And finally, you saw how to build a pipeline in Azure DevOps to do more advanced configuration and have Azure DevOps build and deploy the app to the app service. In the next module, we're going to finish by looking at how to handle deployments that involve database changes.